All episodes of A Trial by Podcast are for informational and entertainment purposes only. Much to their parents' dismay, neither host is a lawyer, journalist, or investigator. Just two people with microphones and Wi-Fi. All actions discussed are alleged, and all parties are innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. For the full legal mumbo-jumbo, check the show notes.
Some disappearances leave behind almost nothing. No witnesses, no crime scene, no credible leads. The 1981 vanishing of Cynthia Jane Anderson from a law office in Toledo, Ohio, is one such case. On the morning of August 4th, 1981, a 20-year-old legal secretary arrived at work. By midday, she was gone without a trace. No goodbye, no note, no evidence of a struggle, and no body ever recovered. More than 4 decades later, her case remains open, unsolved, and haunting. And what makes Anderson's case so compelling, so disturbing, is not merely the mystery of her disappearance, but the strange web of events that preceded it. In the weeks and months before she vanished, Cindy Anderson was being harassed by an unknown caller, plagued by nightmares of abduction and murder, and working at a law office that investigators would later connect to drug trafficking and corruption. The convergence of these threads has fueled decades of speculation, investigation, and heartbreak. This is the mysterious disappearance of Cindy Anderson. Welcome back to the pod, everyone. I am your host, Kelsey. I appreciate you guys for being here. I have a really chilling story for you guys today. Before we dive into it, if you enjoy this episode, share it with a friend, send it to your mom, tell people about the podcast if you're loving it. And if you're really enjoying and you haven't given us a rating yet, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening, and make sure you are following us wherever you're listening so you're always reminded of new episodes. We have new episodes every Tuesday, but in today's episode, we are talking about Cynthia Jane Anderson, who was known to family and friends as Cindy. She was born on February 4th, 1961 in Toledo, Ohio. She was raised by her parents, Margaret and Michael Anderson, in a very devout Christian fundamentalist household where faith was central to daily life. Now, those who knew Cindy described her as warm, cheerful, and deeply rooted in her religious community. She had a steady boyfriend, a close circle of friends, and a family that adored her. By all accounts, she was a young woman who lived her life with purpose and integrity. And at the time of her disappearance, she was just 20 years old. She was working as a legal secretary at the law offices of James Rabbitt and Jay Feldstein. And Rabbitt and Feldstein, are you kidding me? Incredible legal office name. But the office itself was located on East Manhattan Boulevard in Toledo, Ohio. The office itself was located on East Manhattan Boulevard in Toledo, Ohio. But while Cindy worked in Ohio, she didn't actually live in Ohio. She actually lived across state lines in Michigan at her parents' home. So every morning she would make the short commute over to Toledo. And it was a routine that she had followed without incident until the summer of 1981, which brought with it a creeping sense of dread for Cindy. In many ways, August 1981 was supposed to be a turning point for her. She had given notice at her job with plans to leave her secretarial position in about 2 weeks. She and her boyfriend were enrolled to attend Bible college together, and the future just seemed bright and full of promise for her. Those close to her have consistently said that there was nothing in her character or the circumstances of her life that would suggest any desire to walk away. Her life was going exactly as she wanted it to, and she was so close with her family, who described her as deeply attached to her loved ones, but also her faith, someone who would never disappear voluntarily without explanation. The morning of August 4th, 1981 began as any other at the law office on East Manhattan Boulevard. Cindy arrived early, as was her custom, and she began the morning tasks that were part of her daily routine, getting the office set up for the day before the attorneys arrived to actually start working. Now, the office janitor confirmed that he had seen her working in her office at approximately 9:45 a.m., performing her duties as usual, seeming very calm, very normal morning. Like there was nothing weird about what she was doing or how she was acting. However, when 2 of Cindy's coworkers arrived at the office around noon, they found it empty. Cindy was nowhere to be seen. The office was in an unusual state. It wasn't really chaotic or disturbed. It just seemed frozen, like in a kind of suspended ordinariness that immediately raised alarms. Because it was evident that Cindy had been there. The radio was on, the lights were on, and the air conditioning was on. It was pumping. These were all things that were only turned on in the beginning of the day and were turned off before everyone left for the evening. The attorney's desks had been set up for the day. That was part of Cindy's tasks. But not all of her morning tasks had been completed. The mail still sat untouched, wedged in the front door handle where the mailman left it every morning, as if Cindy had been interrupted before she could get to it. Now, her coworkers, they felt in their gut that something was off. Maybe she had an emergency and left in a rush. But why wouldn't she leave a note? That was a big question for them because they'd worked with Cindy for a while, and she was the type of girl who always left a note when she stepped out, even if it was just for a few minutes, like, hey, I went over here, be back in a few minutes. So they begin poking around her desk, looking for a note, have we missed it? Something along those lines. And on her desk, they discover probably the most chilling detail found in the office that day. Cindy had been reading a romance novel. And when her coworkers found it, it was lying on her desk open. But not just to any page. It was open to the only violent scene in the entire book. A passage in which the heroine is abducted at knifepoint, which is just chilling. Like, it gives me goosebumps to think about. Now, whether Cindy had opened the book to that page deliberately and left it as a message, or whether her abductor had left the book as a message, or whether it was just a terrible coincidence and she happened to have put the book down while she was reading that page right before she was abducted, we don't know. It's never been established. But the detail has become one of the most discussed and debated aspects of the case. Now, Cindy's 1980 Chevrolet Citation was still locked in the parking lot outside of the office, though her purse and her car keys were missing. Even stranger, the office doors themselves were locked, just as she had been instructed to keep them when she was there alone. And there was no sign of forced entry anywhere. No broken locks, no damaged windows, no indication that anyone had forced their way in or out of the office. There was no sign of a struggle inside the office either. No overturned furniture, no scattered papers, no signs of any physical altercation of any kind. It seemed as if Cindy had simply slipped out of her own accord, walking away on foot. Now, despite the misleading calmness of the scene, though, Cindy's coworkers knew something bad had happened, and they called police pretty much right away to report Cindy missing. When first responders arrived, coworkers explained why they were so worried. They told police that someone had been harassing Cindy for nearly a year. It started in October of 1980, 10 months prior to her disappearance. And it started with graffiti that had appeared on the wall of a building directly across the street from the law firm where Cindy worked. The wall was in Cindy's direct line of sight from her desk through the office window. So sitting at her desk, she is looking out the window at this graffiti, which read, quote, "I love you, Cindy," and was signed GW. Now, it would be 6 months before this graffiti was painted over. But until it was, Cindy had to spend every day looking out at it, wondering who GW could possibly be. She had no idea, and this was extremely unsettling for her. She didn't know anyone with the initials GW who could have or would have done something like this. There were no men that she could think of who she had turned down recently that might be trying to get back at her. And it wasn't just the message itself that was unsettling. It was the placement. Whoever did this must have known not only just where Cindy worked, but that she could see that from the office every day. Now, once the message was painted over, Cindy felt some relief with the absence of these ominous words. But unfortunately, this relief didn't last long because just a few weeks after it was painted over, the message reappeared. Someone had once again spray painted, quote, "I love you, Cindy," end quote, signed with the initials GW on that same building directly across the street from her office. Only this time, the words were painted even larger. And while the first instance of this message had her unsettled, the second message had her terrified. Because this time, the message had been accompanied by a series of harassing phone calls. The phone calls started just soon before or soon after the message reappeared. And the calls came directly to the law office phone. And I should note that there is no indication that the caller ever contacted Cindy at her home in Michigan. They would only call her at the office. And this had been going on for weeks. It was frequent enough that her employers took formal action, and they installed an emergency buzzer at her desk. And they instructed her to keep the office doors locked at all times, anytime she was there alone. They were doing what they could to make sure that she was safe at work. Now, this emergency buzzer at her desk, when she hits this buzzer, it was set up to alert the shop next door. And obviously, everyone who worked in that shop next door, they were made aware of the situation as well. And they were there to support Cindy and make her feel safe and comfortable. And honestly, guys, I think this is a lot more than some employers would do in this situation. But what's so interesting is that the day she disappeared, this buzzer was not used. She never hit this buzzer, never hit this button. And it's disturbing to think about. She just probably never got the chance. Now, as for what these harassing calls themselves entailed, information is unfortunately scarce. We do know that Cindy told at least one other person that the calls involved obscene language, but she largely kept the details of what exactly was said to herself. And she really seemed to be trying to deflect concern from those around her. Oh, it's okay. It's going to be fine. They were just swearing at me, whatever, kind of trying to play it off. But the people who knew and loved her could tell that these calls scared her. Now, the harassment reached a very visible peak on August 3rd, 1981, the day before she vanished. A client of the law office, Larry Mullins, was present in the office when Cindy received a phone call. He watched as she answered the phone and became visibly shaken, her distress obvious enough that Mullins felt compelled to ask her what was wrong. What did they say? What's going on? Now, she brushes off his concern, but Mullins was not satisfied by this. He was so alarmed by what he witnessed that he contacted local police and requested that officers conduct a drive-by check of the office to ensure Cindy's safety. In fact, he requested that they do this a few times a day because he could tell that whatever was said on that phone call had her deeply, deeply disturbed. And it sounds like officers agreed to do this, though ultimately it would not prevent what would happen to her the very next day. If you've been listening to our podcast for a while now, you know that looks can be deceiving. We hear it in stories all the time. But the same thing goes for your water. It looks clear, it has no smell, no taste, no warning signs whatsoever. But hiding inside your tap water right now could be lead, forever chemicals, microplastics, chlorine, contaminants that are linked to fatigue, hormone disruption, cognitive decline, and major health issues down the line. Standard filters let most of these contaminants walk right through. AquaTrue is a countertop purifier tested and certified to remove 84 contaminants using a patented 4-stage reverse osmosis system. There's no plumbing, no installation, and AquaTrue's been featured in Business Insider, Popular Science. It's been named the best countertop water filter by Good Housekeeping, and 98% of customers say that their water is cleaner, safer, and healthier. And that's a track record that you can take to court. Go to aquatrue.com and use promo code ATrialByPodcast for 20% off your purifier. It comes with a 30-day best tasting water guarantee or your money back. That's AquaTrue, AQUATRU.com. Promo code ATrialByPodcast. But these calls and the graffiti, they weren't the only things plaguing Cindy that summer. For months, she had been tormented by recurring nightmares. She described these dreams to her mother, Margaret, as terrifying visions of being abducted and brutally murdered by a man she didn't recognize. Her mother did not take the nightmares seriously at the time. They're just nightmares, right? And there's a lot of things that can cause nightmares: stress, anxiety, watching a scary movie. But in the context of everything that would follow, these nightmares take on a chilling significance. Whether they were the product of subconscious fear about the very real danger she felt she was in, or just some sort of cruel psychic vision of the future, or merely coincidence, no one knows. Now, the investigation into Cindy's disappearance was immediate, but in many critical ways, it was frustratingly inconclusive. The physical evidence at the scene was both sparse and strange. The locked doors, the absence of a struggle, and the missing purse and keys, these all presented detectives with a puzzle that didn't fit neatly together. It didn't fit neatly into any single theory. Was it an abduction? Was there a voluntary disappearance? Did she run away? Was this a murder that was made to look like neither of these things? Each of these possibilities was explored, but each ran into walls. Now, investigators started by narrowing down the timeline. And based on the fact that no telephone calls were answered by Cindy after approximately 10 a.m. that day, investigators concluded that she had either left the office or been taken from the office between 9:45 a.m. when the janitor last confirmed seeing her and 10 a.m., which obviously this is a short window of just 15 minutes. And I believe the reason that they use 10 o'clock as like a strict cutoff is because a call came in at that time that they could tell was not answered. Now, police canvassed the surrounding shopping plaza. They interviewed workers and business owners nearby, but no one reported seeing Cindy leave that day. They didn't report hearing any sort of disturbance or even noticing anything unusual during that very small window of time. The shop next door, which the emergency buzzer was designed to alert, they hadn't received any sort of alert. They didn't hear anything crazy happening in the office next door. They didn't hear any screaming. They didn't see Cindy running out of the office or leaving at a weird time. And there were no witnesses that reported, seeing Cindy get into a car with someone or even leaving the building. Like, no one saw her leave this building. Now, given the locked doors, the absence of forced entry, and the total lack of any sign of struggle, the most plausible explanation that emerged was that whoever Cindy either left with or was taken by was someone that she probably knew, or at least admitted into the office herself. Maybe it was someone who worked in the building. Maybe it was a client. Maybe it was someone Cindy knew personally outside of work. But the idea that a stranger forced entry without leaving any trace just didn't make any sense. It seemed like whoever was there was someone that she let into this office or she left willingly with. Now, one of the most significant early leads came not from the crime scene itself, but from an anonymous phone call received by investigators in September 1981, just 1 month after Cindy vanished. A woman called, speaking in a whisper, but she sounded scared. She told investigators that Cindy was being held captive in the basement of a white house, one of 2 side-by-side houses owned by the same family. According to the caller, the parents of the household were out of town, and their son was the one holding Cindy against her will. The caller repeated throughout the conversation that she was scared, that she needed to go, and that she could not provide her name or address. She had to stay anonymous. When investigators pressed this anonymous caller for more details, they're like, what's the address of the home? What's the family's name? What's the name of this guy? Anything to help them locate this house. She just evaded these questions, eventually hanging up on them. Now, she did call back a short time later, but when a second investigator attempted to listen in on like a phone extension, like on another line, she realized what was happening. She realized that someone was listening in, and she hung up again. And after the second call, she never called back. Now, police did do a search of Toledo based on this limited description, looking for 2 houses next door to each other, both owned by the same family, with at least one of them being white. But this whole search was fruitless. They could never come up with anything that matched that description. And to this day, the identity of this caller remains unknown. So it's one of those things where who knows if this was real information or not. And if it was real, what did she see? Was she a witness to something terrible? Was she herself in danger or being coerced? Or was she just a fucking asshole making a prank phone call in the midst of a missing persons investigation? No one knows, and I don't know that we ever will. Now, meanwhile, during this time, investigators examined the financial and administrative record of Cindy's life, just looking for any sign that she had simply chosen to disappear. Was she opening new bank accounts? Was she closing old ones? Were there any signs she was preparing to move? But they found nothing. In fact, they found pretty much the opposite. They found a substantial amount of money that Cindy had in her bank account, and it was never touched after the day she disappeared. And there were no large withdrawals leading up to her disappearance. Her social security number was never used again. She never made contact with her boyfriend, her friends, or any member of her family again. And for investigators who are familiar with voluntary disappearances, these facts spoke loudly. People who choose to vanish almost always eventually access their money or use their identification. Cindy never did either of those things. As investigators combed through the details of her disappearance, one figure emerged almost immediately as a person of significant interest: the building's janitor, who had been the last person to ever see Cindy alive at 9:45 a.m. that morning. Interestingly, the janitor's initials were, you guessed it, GW. Now, he worked in the building regularly, so he was not an employee of the law office, to my understanding. He was an employee of the office building itself. So he had keys to all of the office doors. And that, of course, carried enormous weight with investigators. If Cindy had been taken by force and there are no signs of forced entry, her abductor would have needed a way to lock the office door. And that last detail carries enormous weight because remember, those office doors were locked when the other employees arrived. And in order to lock these doors from the outside, you have to have a key. And this janitor, GW, was one of the few people that would have a key to this office. Now, with that being said, we also need to remember that Cindy's keys were missing. And of course, she had a key to this office. So while I think this man is worth looking into, I don't know that him having a key is that important because whoever took Cindy, assuming her keys and her purse were with her, they would have access to the key at that point. But still, when you're the last person to see a missing person and then your initials are the same initials as the graffiti across the street that says, "I love you, Cindy," you're going to be looked into. Detective William Adams of the Toledo Police Department worked with Cindy's friends and colleagues trying to get more information on who GW might be. Obviously, this janitor was the only suspect with those initials who could be placed in and around the building with legitimate access that day. He was questioned by investigators, but there was no physical evidence or anything found connecting him to Cindy or her disappearance or the calls made to her or anything like that. And no charges were ever filed against him. He did end up passing away before the case was resolved, leaving that thread permanently open. And honestly, he seems like a great suspect, right? Like, you can't get over the two things, being the last person to see her and the initials. It's like the initials do it for you. They're really, really hard to ignore. However, the importance of these initials seems to diminish greatly when years later, a woman named Cynthia Betts comes forward to talk to the police about this graffiti. Now, according to Cynthia Betts, the messages painted on the wall were for her, not for Cindy Anderson. Again, this is years after Cindy disappeared, is when she finally comes forward. And she tells investigators that the GW who painted the messages, this was her boyfriend at the time, Greg Wyszynski. Now, Greg reportedly had a habit of writing "I love you, Cindy" and CJ plus GW in locations all around Toledo. And he had painted the message on the wall near the law office simply because he lived in the area. According to Cynthia, she knew for certain that both of these messages, both of the "I love you, Cindy's," were painted by her boyfriend for her. He specifically said that that piece of graffiti itself was done by him. And Greg and Cynthia, they had no knowledge or connection to Cindy Anderson. Like, he didn't even know who she was. So based on Cynthia's story that she's telling police years later, it sounds like the graffiti was all a coincidence. It sounds like it was never meant for Cindy at all. But sadly, we can't confirm this with Greg because he died in a motorcycle accident in 1983. So he wasn't there to back up this story. So it's hard to say whether or not this graffiti was actually related to Cindy's disappearance. But my gut is telling me that it was just some horrible coincidence. I don't think that this Cynthia Betts has any reason to lie about this. Her story seems to make sense. And police also seem to believe that the graffiti was probably unrelated to Cindy's case and unrelated to the harassing phone calls that she had been receiving. And it's also like if this was done by some sort of stalker or someone who's harassing Cindy, why would they write their actual initials? You know what I mean? But whether or not that graffiti was meant for Cindy, the question of who was making those obscene phone calls remained one of the most pressing and unresolved threads of the investigation. The calls had begun around the time the second graffiti appeared, and they stopped, of course, when Cindy disappeared. There were no more harassing or obscene phone calls made to the law office after Cindy was gone. And this obviously indicates that these calls were indeed meant for her and her alone. But investigators were never able to trace them or identify the caller. However, the fact that the calls were always made to the office itself and never to Cindy's home, this made the investigators wonder if her disappearance had something to do with her work at the firm. Because if this is just some stalker who's obsessed with Cindy, I love you, Cindy, why wouldn't they be bothering her at home as well? And this whole theory becomes more tangible in the years after her disappearance, when a lot more information about what was going on in that law office at the time starts to come out. And what we know now, looking back, is that by 1981, the law firm had become entangled in serious criminal activity. One of the attorneys who worked in association with the firm, so like he wasn't one of the owners, but this attorney, Richard Neller, he was simultaneously representing a convicted drug dealer named Jose Rodriguez Jr., while also allegedly participating in Rodriguez's drug distribution operation. So he's defending the guy and also like taking a cut and like getting in on this whole drug operation, which is so narcos of him. Now, of course, it was public record that Neller was defending Rodriguez, but when it starts to come out that Neller was actually involved in the criminal activity itself, investigators started wondering if Neller had something to do with Cindy's disappearance. And they came to believe that Cindy, working alone in the office each morning and fielding calls and visitors on behalf of the lawyers, maybe she had overheard conversations between Neller and Rodriguez that she was never meant to hear. Conversations about drug deals, about money, or just the mechanics of their operation overall. If she heard anything that implicated Neller himself in criminal activity, this knowledge made her a liability. And investigators thought maybe she was silenced to protect them, to stop Cindy from sharing any of this knowledge. And this theory gained its most dramatic wave of support in 1995 when a federal grand jury indicted 9 individuals connected to a large drug distribution ring in Toledo. And of course, Rodriguez was the ringleader of this entire operation. And amongst those charged was Richard Neller, the attorney. During Rodriguez's trial, his prison cellmate Scott Hansen testified that Rodriguez himself had confessed to killing Cindy with a 9mm handgun on Neller's orders, specifically because she had overheard their conversations incriminating Neller. Now, Hansen's story does shift a bit because he later claims that Rodriguez said he did it not on Neller's orders, but to send a message to Neller, who Rodriguez felt had inadequately represented him in a previous trial. Now, of course, even though his story is shifting over time, this was a stunning piece of testimony. But the judge ultimately deemed it unreliable, and it was thrown out. This testimony was not allowed to be used as evidence against Rodriguez and Neller. Now, Rodriguez was sentenced to 38 years in prison for conducting a criminal enterprise, and Neller received 5.5 years for conspiracy to distribute narcotics. So like Neller was fucking in there like swimwear. It's not just like he knew what was going on and didn't say anything, and so now he's in trouble. He was like pretty much the director of operations of this drug ring. Now, neither man was ever charged in connection with Cindy's disappearance, and Richard Neller died in May of 2024 at the age of 74 years old, taking whatever knowledge he had about what happened to Cindy, if any, to the grave. Now, there are more theories that we are going to go through, but I just want to pause here because in my mind, this seems like the most likely theory. Whether it was Rodriguez or Neller or someone else who worked with them, I don't know. But there's a few reasons I feel so strongly about this theory. Firstly, I don't personally believe that the graffiti was related to Cindy. I feel like Cynthia Betts' explanation of this graffiti makes a lot of sense. I don't see any motive for her to make this up, and I think it may have just been a very unfortunate coincidence. But really what does it for me with this theory is the calls themselves and how little people knew about what was being said on these calls. Remember, they're only going to the law office. They're not going to her home. And when people are asking her what is happening during these harassing calls, she's like, well, they're using obscene language and whatever. And when people are expressing concern for her over this, it's said that she was kind of trying to placate them, like, oh, don't worry about it. It's fine. It's just, they're just using obscene language and kind of brushing it off, not really sharing what the calls were about or how they're making her feel. And this is odd to me. I feel like if I was scared and I'm getting these calls, I would be telling people in detail about them. Because if something did happen to me, I would want people to know as much information as possible about this person who's harassing me. And the fact that she is being very coy about the situation and brushing it off like, oh no, they're just using obscene language, it's okay. But then she's still scared enough to where she is getting a buzzer installed on her desk for emergencies. It makes me think that she possibly knew why this person was harassing her and what it was about. And the fact that she wasn't sharing that information makes me wonder if it was because she was scared that sharing that information of what was being said on the calls and why she was getting these calls was what she believed was going to lead to something bad happening to her. I don't know if I said that in the most clear way, but the idea that she had information about this drug ring that she knew put her in danger, that makes sense to me why she wouldn't be sharing that with other people. Maybe she knew that she had knowledge that she was not supposed to have, and that's why she was being so coy about these calls. Again, we do not know any of this. This is just me speculating. But if you really think through this theory, I think it makes sense. But of course, Neller and Rodriguez were not the only suspects in this case. There were also two brothers, Anthony and Nathaniel Cook, who were looked into heavily because the Cook brothers were two of the most prolific killers in Toledo's history. Between them, the brothers were convicted of 9 murders in the Toledo area committed between 1973 and 1981. And several of those crimes occurred in or near the same shopping plaza where Cindy worked. And it's not just the geography of where they're committing these crimes. It's also the timing that overlaps almost perfectly with Cindy's disappearance. Anthony and Nathaniel's victims were predominantly young white men and women targeted alone or while vulnerable. There were couples that were ambushed late at night. There was a teenage hitchhiker. There was a young woman who was offered a ride during a snowstorm. And Cindy fit this profile. She was a young white woman. Now, the brothers were known to stalk their victims before striking, and their crimes involved abduction, rape, and killing by whatever weapon was at hand. This ranged from guns to a baseball bat to a brick, horrifically. And notably, just 2 days before Cindy vanished, Anthony Cook had murdered a couple, hiding their bodies in the trunk of their car. So when I say the timing lines up, the timing fucking lines up. This is 2 days before she disappears. However, Cindy's case does differ from the Cook brothers' known pattern in one important way. She disappeared from inside a locked office with no signs of forced entry or struggle, whereas their attacks typically involved ambushing victims in outdoor or isolated settings. So these seem to be like more crimes of opportunity rather than like well thought out, like meticulously planned abductions, which it seems like Cindy's had to have been. They had to have known that Cindy was there alone at that time. Now, both of the Cook brothers were questioned, but denied any involvement in Cindy's case, and no physical evidence has ever surfaced to connect them to her in any way. When the brothers confessed to their crimes as a part of a 2000 plea deal, Cindy Anderson was not among the victims they named, and they named a lot of victims, okay? There were 9 people. Of course, we don't know. Does that really reflect innocence or does it reflect omission? Are they just not saying her name because they know that they don't have the evidence to prove it? Now, Nathaniel Cook, just to like kind of follow up on where the Cook brothers are nowadays, Nathaniel Cook was eventually granted parole in 2018, meaning he is out and about, while Anthony Cook remains incarcerated, at least from what I could find at the time of this recording, in May of 2026. He did request parole, but it was just denied. And while, again, I tend to lean towards the theory about, Neller and Rodriguez and the crime, the Cook brothers have never been officially cleared. It's not like they've been ruled out from being responsible for this. Really, it seems like no one has been officially ruled out. Now, there was also a 4th suspect that I read about, a convicted murderer who is currently imprisoned in Ohio. And he was, I guess, identified by investigators as a possible person of interest. But his name has never been publicly released. And no connection to Cindy's case has ever been formally established. They just kind of like mentioned this guy. They're like, yeah, there's another guy in prison that we were looking at, but we don't have much yet, and then kind of left it at that. But the withholding of his identity from the public record, that itself is kind of unusual when someone is already imprisoned. And it has been the subject of ongoing speculation of, well, maybe this is a really solid lead, and that's why they're keeping it close to the chest, because they're still investigating. But no one really knows. To me, there doesn't seem to be a lot pointing at the Cook brothers. The fact that we know nothing about this other person of interest, they're just not super convincing theories to me. And when I look at these theories, there's really 2 that stand above the rest in terms of evidentiary weight. Of course, like I said, it's the drug trafficking theory is number 1 for me. I think it's very likely that Cindy was murdered because she knew too much about Neller and Rodriguez's operation. Whether it was Neller or Rodriguez or both of them or someone else who worked with them that was actually responsible for her murder, I don't really know. I don't really have a strong opinion on that. But I think the idea that her disappearance and probable murder is connected to this drug operation in some way is compelling. It's a very clear motive. Neller would have known when Cindy is in the office, when she's there alone. He would have known, what time to go in, what time to go out, how to avoid the janitor. He wouldn't have been, if the janitor saw him, the janitor wouldn't be alarmed. And again, not saying that I think it was Neller specifically. I don't know. But I do strongly believe that the whole drug ring is related. Now, second to the drug ring theory, the stalker theory is also, I feel like, somewhat credible. And in some ways, depending on what you believe about the graffiti, it might even be more consistent of the events in the months prior. If you're not convinced by Cynthia Betts's explanation of this graffiti, the graffiti doesn't really make sense to the drug trafficking theory. If someone was harassing Cindy because of knowledge she had, why would they be writing, "I love you, Cindy"? So there are people who really feel that this graffiti is related. They say, why wouldn't Cynthia Betts come forward right away? This was plastered all over the news in Toledo. The graffiti was mentioned. And this is something that Cynthia Betts is asked about. And she just kind of says, I was young and I didn't know what to do and whatever. And after years and years of hearing about this graffiti, I knew it was just on my conscience and I had to come forward. But some people call bullshit on this. They say the fact that it's right across the street from Cindy's office, that it is visible from her desk through the office window, and that the second graffiti was painted as soon as she starts getting these phone calls, they say it's too much of a coincidence. Now, these 2 theories, the stalker versus the drug trafficking ring, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. It is possible that the person making the calls was connected to the law firm's criminal ring or whatever Neller was doing, and that this person was just using the graffiti as harassment, as a tool of intimidation before ultimately following through with something far worse. But the reason I just can't get myself to really think the graffiti is involved is just because if it was the drug traffickers, why would they paint that graffiti, leave it up for 6 months, not make any calls, and then repaint it with the calls now? I don't know. And also, if you're painting this intimidating message because she has knowledge that you don't want her to say anything about, wouldn't you paint something more intimidating? Like, wouldn't you want her to know that you're the one that painted that graffiti? Why would you put, "I love you, Cindy, GW"? Unless maybe GW was the person responsible. Maybe GW was related to this drug trafficking ring. And Cindy knew who GW was. And maybe she just was too scared to tell anyone. I don't know. Personally, I don't believe it's related, but that's just me. And that's the thing about this case is there are so many unanswered questions. But what can be said with reasonable confidence is this. Cindy Anderson did not leave voluntarily. Her bank account was untouched. Her social security number was unused. And she never spoke a word to anyone she loved ever again. Now, Toledo police believe that she was likely murdered very soon after she went missing. But her body has never been found. And with all this evidence, or lack thereof, really, I come back to the book, the romance novel that was left open on her desk, to the only page that described a violent abduction of a young woman at knifepoint. Was this really just a huge coincidence that she goes missing after putting her book down with that page open? And also, who puts a book down open? Like, wouldn't you mark the page, fold the tab over, put something inside of it and close it if you're pausing reading it for the time being? And it was like laid neatly on her desk. It wasn't, thrown on the floor and happened to be open to that page. It seemed like it was intentionally placed there. But the intentionality of it being placed like that with that specific page open is unknown. And of course, the other option is whoever took her, whoever is responsible for what happened to her, they left the book like that. But it just seems odd. Like, this was a book. From everything that I read, it sounds like Cindy was reading this book. This was her book. So how would her abductor know? And why would they leave it open like that? What message would they be trying to send with that? Was it a little wink wink of this is exactly what happened here? And how did they know to open the book to that page? How did they know that this romance novel had a scene like that? It's just a detail that is truly so unsettling. And that combined with the fact that she was having these nightmares leading up to her death. Like, she's telling her mom she's having these nightmares that she's being kidnapped at gunpoint by a man she doesn't recognize and murdered. I mean, it is just chilling. And that's why, again, I go back to this drug trafficking ring theory, because if she knew she had some information that she wasn't supposed to have, information that put her in danger, I mean, if that wouldn't give you nightmares about being kidnapped and murdered, I don't know what would. Now, if you guys have been listening to a lot of true crime podcasts or you watch a lot of true crime shows, you've probably heard of Cindy's case before. It's a case that has never really faded from public consciousness, even as the decades have passed. And I feel like this page of the book is part of the reason why. It's a detail so mysterious and interesting that people, love to speculate on. And that makes it a good case for discussion. But it's one of those things that, while it's intriguing, we always have to go back and remember it's not intriguing to the family. Every unanswered question mark, no matter how interesting we all find it, is just another devastating blow to this family who has no idea what happened to their daughter. Though I hope that this page of the book, keeping this case alive, has helped the investigation, and that one day this case will be solved. This case is plastered everywhere. It's been on Unsolved Mysteries, which reaches millions of viewers. And obviously, it's been covered extensively by true crime podcasts just like this one. Now, the passage of time has taken most of those who loved Cindy Anderson. Her mother, Margaret, died of cancer in 1983, just 2 years after Cindy disappeared. And her father, Michael, died in 2008. In his obituary, Cindy was listed as having preceded him in death, a quiet acknowledgement from the family that after more than 2 decades of waiting and searching, they had come to believe that she was no longer alive. And this seems to be the same conclusion that the police hold. They think that Cindy has been murdered. And to this day, the case is open, and they are accepting tips. So anyone with information is urged to contact the Toledo Police Department at 419-245-3151. That is 419-245-3151. Or you can make an anonymous tip to Toledo Crime Stoppers at 419-255-1111. That's 419-255-1111. And now, while Cindy's case is somewhat cold, I feel as if this is a solvable case. And I know it doesn't seem like, there's not a ton of physical evidence. It's not like there's DNA that they're just waiting to match to someone someday. But I think that if this drug trafficking ring was involved in Cindy's disappearance, I think it's very likely that people know what happened to Cindy. These people who were involved in this drug trafficking ring, even if they weren't involved in Cindy's disappearance or murder, they likely have knowledge of what happened to her. Not all of them, but I don't believe that, it's like one of these guys killed Cindy and never told anyone else. Like, this is an operation. This is, this is a team of people. There's a leadership. There's a hierarchy. And I think these people know. And, nowadays, these people are getting older. They're having children and all of these things. So part of me just hopes that there is either a deathbed confession of some sort, or this story is shared. Someone knows, like, I overheard my dad when I was a kid telling my mom about this horrible thing he did. I just believe that someone knows what happened. And I truly hope that if you even think there's an iota of a chance that you know something about this case, but you're not sure, please come forward. Please call the Toledo Police or Crime Stoppers. Tell them what you know, even if you don't know for sure. That's what the police are there for. They're there to look into those tips and determine whether or not they are actually connected to this case. And I just feel so strongly that if the drug trafficking ring was in some way responsible, which it seems like they were, in my opinion, there are people out there who know. And just because Cindy's parents have passed away doesn't mean that her disappearance doesn't matter. She deserves justice, even if whoever did this to her is dead already. She deserves the knowledge of who did this to her to be out there, to be closed. I know that if something ever happened to me, I don't care if my whole family is gone. I don't care if this person never pays the price for what they did to me. I would want those answers out there. I would want them known. Especially in her case, where this has been covered so greatly. I just want to know this person's name so we can give them like a big fuck you, even if they're dead. But hopefully one day I will be coming back to do a follow-up episode because we know what happened to Cindy. But until that day comes, share her story, especially if you live in Ohio. Most of you guys probably know if you've been listening for a while, but I live in Ohio. I have friends in Toledo, so share the story. Anyways, thank you guys for listening, and I will see you next Tuesday.